given that I'm at the end of the day, hopefully this will illuminate some of a bigger systems issue and at the scale beyond just individual system that I think we are now facing because of the higher spectrum usage, as well as more technologies that don't fit well into the classical cellular or Wi-Fi type model. So what I want to talk about is that we all everybody wants spectrum, whether it's radio astronomers or carriers have ideas. They want it to be preferably free, preferably unused. Importantly, given that the market for devices is now a global market, not a national market, any spectrum that's made available is far more valuable if it's not just available in the United States, but available at least in major markets, Asian markets, European market in that, and preferably under similar conditions. So that you don't have to build custom hardware for each market in that, or have radio receivers and transmitters in the device that are only usable in certain markets. Importantly, and something we kind of talked about a little bit in the radio astronomy world in the SAM presentation, is it's no longer just about the band, it is really about the neighbors. Often you want to avoid that you have noisy neighbors that leak into your band, or and means you have to have better filters, or that they have very sensitive neighbors that are very picky about any out-of-band emissions that you might cause. Ideally, we want spectrum that works well to walls and glass and so on. Also helps if you don't have to decrease your bandwidth whenever it rains, or if you're under a leaf cover. And that these days, any band that is smaller than 5 megahertz is probably of very limited practical interest. You want at least 20 megahertz and possibly 100 megahertz is really nice. Traditionally, that's become less important. You want paired spectrum that has uplink and downlink frequencies. And if you can help it, the midband has been partially attractive, not just because it is has reasonably familiar propagation characteristics, but it also means that the electronics are both cheaper and less power hungry. And you want obviously small antennas too for mobile devices. Well, that spectrum, if it ever existed, no longer does. So we work in a compromise environment where we have to see how we can manage in an environment where we can't have all of these things. And what has happened, even though we haven't really had a kind of official pronouncement of that change, is that over the past 20 years, we really had a fundamental transition how we manage spectrum at the policy level. Used to be that we had essentially single purpose spectrum, was for either TV or pagers or something. In many countries, including the United States, for some bands, technical characteristics such as modulation were prescribed. Generally, it was for exclusive use of a particular application or carrier. The bands tended to be narrow, with TV as a 6 megahertz band being by far the widest. And there was an implicit assumption, even though that wasn't really spelled out, that almost all radios would operate at a single frequency at a time in that, or that many radios really had only one radio per device that they could operate at any given time. You worried about out-of-band emissions to like receivers. So TV stations had to make sure that it didn't interfere with other neighboring TV stations. Spectral efficiency was not really a major concern. You wouldn't even know how to characterize it. Many of the band assignments were single country band assignments, so they differed widely, even for kind of common services like cellular across countries and continents. And most of the interest in wireless spectrum was for outdoor transmission, whether that was TV as an outdoor antennas, or outdoor FM radio for cars or for early cellular systems. Certainly mostly assumed that people would use a fixed device in the home if they have a phone on the kitchen wall, and then have a mobile phone when they were out of the house. Now, almost all of these have flipped. We are now almost, and this is not just the US, it's broadly speaking that spectrum is licensed for flexible use in technology. Besides the mask, there's really no requirements as to the service or the modulation or other characteristics that are used. We have many more services that are shared on over and underlay. Generally, we go for much broader bands. We can generally assume that devices have multiple radios, meaning spectrum is valuable even if it is not universally available geographically. Even if I can't get a particular band in a particular region, I have other bands to fall back on. We're starting to talk about requirements for receivers. Spectral efficiency is now a concern, even though we struggle to define it. Get to that. And there's much more international coordination beyond just the classical satellite and HF type of bands and broad coordination. And indeed, most of the data that we consume is consumed indoors. Probably 80% of the data is not consumed outdoors, but indoors. And you've all seen versions of this chart. I only put it up to show that what a mix of legacy and more modern technologies exist. We can't get rid of those. We talked about radio astronomy, which is given by physics, but we also have lots of legacy or long-running services that are not going anywhere. And they're interspersed all over the map. So we're moving towards a much more interesting model, and this was mentioned earlier on some of the Wi-Fi concerns, that even things that used to be pretty simple, like Wi-Fi, now we have concerns about what happens if everybody piles into that, including carriers using some hybrid between licensed and unlicensed models. So in the unlicensed, just to illustrate that, even though the technology hasn't changed fundamentally, as in we're still using primarily with 2.4 and 5.8 gigahertz band, is we had a pretty simple environment in the early days. It was largely sharing among friends, as in the people you would be competing with, or the access points, were most likely owned by the same entity. Unless you were in a really busy apartment building or you saw your neighbor's AP, most of it was when you would see your own APs in an enterprise in particular, and you could manage interference and frequency coordination relatively well. Now we have public Wi-Fi, like cable Wi-Fi. We have the kind of model of essentially Wi-Fi base stations, and most of the Wi-Fi is no longer kind of natural frequency division like in the early 2.4 gigahertz band, but essentially uses the whole band in an OFDMA model. And we have then the kind of as well, which pose much more fundamental rules about what is sharing like if somebody is greedy and wants to consume the whole band. We have tons of radios. Modern devices, both cheap and expensive, can operate operate on a huge number of band classes, LTE band classes or 5G NR band classes, not necessarily simultaneously, but they also have multiple radios which can operate simultaneously in that. So what we have, as I mentioned earlier, we've largely transitioned to kind of a mixture of unlicensed and auction models as the model. This is one way to describe it, is even people who work on auctions are not necessarily convinced that it is the best one. It is just the only sustainable model of spectrum management that we have been able to find. Economists tend to like it for a variety of reasons, and it has at least some proof that it can work, at least, or it has worked reasonably well compared to beauty contests and other older models. So the idea, and this is from the Australian Spectrum Act, is that it auctions allocate spectrum to the highest value use of users, expressed by people paying real money. And it allows spectrum to move from one use case to that higher value use. And the idea is that it also, auctions often provide the least cost and least restrictive approach to achieving those objectives of highest use in that. And they provide, by providing semi-property rights to that, long-term licenses, certainty and flexibility in that, and hopefully encourage higher spectrum utilization. So we tend to think of auctions as kind of, it's an auction. And when we all mean, if we're not familiar, if we're not involved in the details of FCC spectrum auctions, we all think of them as something that looks roughly similar to what you see on TV when a prize steer is auctioned off at a county fair. What has actually happened is that every recent FCC spectrum auction for cellular and communication spectrum has really been a unicorn, as in there's no two auctions that are exactly similar in terms of mechanics and in terms of constraints. So they differ widely. So how do you determine prices? Do you do a single round sealed bid, which is kind of what we are probably familiar with as non-auctioneers, so to say? You submit a sealed envelope with whatever you're willing to pay, or is it a clock auction where the price ticks up in each round? Is it a combinatorial auction for multiple blocks? Is it simultaneous multiple round options where nothing gets auctions until everything is auctioned? Do you separate the assignment phase of the spectrum? Do you just generically assign blocks and then you assign the specific one in each region separately? Do you have to do a two-sided auction? I'll mention that briefly. Do you give bidding credits for designated entities like tribal entities or small companies? Do you cap the spectrum that certain large providers can't bid on spectrum, actually? What are the build-out requirements? Do you have to build out within a certain number of years? And is it an indefinite license, or would you have to renew it in some way after 10 years? And what's the geography of the auction? So all of these mean that there is a wide set of tools that you can use in disagreement as to what the best auction is. Just to illustrate kind of how complicated this can get, some of you may be familiar with an auction which took place about 4 years ago now, namely where roughly, in the end, were 70 megahertz of TV spectrum, 600 megahertz band, so low band spectrum, was auctioned off. First, where TV stations could name a price to go off the air, and then during the forward auction, carriers would bid on that particular spectrum. Or the CBRS auction was mentioned, where we, for the first time, really had a combination of three classes of users, namely the incumbent federal users, radar, primarily priority license that were auctioned, and the general authorized use, which is kind of a semi-unlicensed model with a spectrum database. In that, with a wide difference in where spectrum was available. So if we look at kind of auction and the related model, is we now actually have existence proofs of a wide variety of dials that we can tune to make spectrum available, all the way from kind of unlicensed indoor and outdoor run, kind of the older Wi-Fi model, to reverse auctions, to two-sided auctions type. We can dial the blocks that we have, smaller and larger blocks, with geographic areas, the build-out requirements for duration, with very different outcomes as to competition, spectral efficiency, technology development, and so on. So without going into great detail, one of the metrics that's used to evaluate the outcome of a spectrum auction is to look at how many dollars were paid per megahertz per population, per a person served. This assumes largely cellular type of licenses as opposed to, say, IoT type applications. And we now know what happens, as in that there are a certain number of certain characteristics which increase or decrease that amount. I won't go through that. You can look at it. And we can see that the valuation of spectrum, even in relatively close by timeframes, varies dramatically. Like say a high in 6 years ago in the AWS3 paired spectrum for relatively low bandwidths of $2.71 per dollar megahertz pop, to just a very small amount, let's say in the 24 gigahertz band, simply because it's a very different band than some of the more traditional bands that had happened. So also the traditional notions of a beauty contest, I mean, the prettiest carrier will win, is that to just a pure auction, kind of a pure libertarian auction, so that's the highest bid wins, is that in practice, these two have actually been converging simply because of all the conditions that are being attached to auctions. I just wanted to emphasize that when we talk about auction, something which didn't matter all that much a few years ago, namely the geographic sizing of the auction areas, now has become a primary battle of auction design. Namely, do you assign licenses on a per county basis? So that's about 3,000 in the United States. Do you assign it for seller market areas, which is about a tenth of that? Or do you design it on economic areas, which is another divided by 2, roughly 1 in that? And the decision fundamentally influences who can deploy spectrum for what purposes, what kind of companies are left over, so to say, for doing that type of spectrum deployment work, and how complicated the auction will be. But spectrums as seen now, auctions are now seen as having side effects that were maybe ignorable a few years ago, but have led to some not so great outcomes. So in particular, spectrum auctions are often celebrated by how many billions of dollars they bring in. But that also means that you essentially, particularly if the provision of services is competitive, this is essentially a consumer spectrum tax. Nobody says that, but that money, that 80 billion for the C-band auction, this is not funny money that comes out of, I don't know, Bitcoin speculation or something. This is when somebody has to pay that. And by standard economic theory, if a market is competitive, that raises the cost for everybody who deploys that new input. And so that means about $100. What you're really saying is that $80 is essentially a $100 tax on every consumer in the United States, that uses mobile technology. The notion to celebrate the technology neutrality of auctions is that you really implicitly, however, assume that each auction area has exactly one service provider, or at least a very small number. Usually might have a few blocks that you can auction separately, but usually that just means 3 or 4 at the most. So for example, if you want to do more campus or industrial area use for a company, how to do? It essentially assumes kind of large scale propagation, circular coverage, rather than kind of directional beams that don't interfere with each other. It doesn't really accommodate time sharing or subcarrier sharing in that, because again, there's an exclusive band, there's a frequency division allocation in almost all cases. Because spectrum bands, once they're auctioned, you're not going to get any more of it, is essentially it freezes the competitive structure of a market. Meaning that the idea that we could, for example, create a new wireless carrier to restore the number of 4 carriers, nationwide carriers in the US, is fiction until that carrier has actual spectrum. Now, we happen to have one, Dish, that has had accumulated a bunch of spectrum. They're trying to do that, but beyond that, it is extremely difficult simply because there is no mid-band spectrum, for example, low-band spectrum available for a new entrant. It's also, and again, I mentioned a company that has often been accused of doing that, is how do you prevent entities that simply hoard spectrum because they believe that 10 years from now, that same band is much more valuable than it is now? Say, Ted is right, maybe people should be buying off terahertz spectrum and hold on to it for a few years and then sell it at a significant profit when the technology has matured to make that actually commercially viable. And it does not impose expectations on receivers. So it's also a one-time estimate of value. Namely, whatever the spectrum is valued at the auction time. Usually most licenses, for a variety of practical reasons, are licensed indefinitely or renewable, assumption of renewal, but the value of spectrum may go down. For example, some of the spectrum that was licensed for voice services at very small bands, like AWS spectrum, probably has significantly lower value now than it did when it was auctioned, simply because nobody cares about 1 megahertz slices anymore, just not interesting. And you might actually get new neighbors that change the value, new spectrum neighbors. Valuing impaired spectrum that is only intermittently available, like CBRS, or has incumbent users like EBS that you need to accommodate, tends to lower the value of spectrum and difficult to value in an auction. And again, speculation is a long-term concern. Even if you're not allowed to sell the spectrum, you can just sell your company. And if its main asset really is the spectrum and it has accumulated. Again, it freezes a particular economic competition model as well. The other one is, again, how do you estimate the value of spectrum? If we struggle, should we assign a band to unlicensed or licensed use? Purely an economic ground. How do you value unlicensed spectrum? All the estimates are usually pretty bogus, as in different people come to radically different conclusions of a Wi-Fi alliance is going to come up to billions and billions of dollars, and the carrier saying, no, you should license. We are going to do much better, put it to much better use, give it to us, auction it to us instead. And there's really no accepted way of resolving that. How do you encourage more efficient use of existing spectrum? Namely, not just kind of bits per second per hertz, but also per square mile type of thing. And you have some very complicated indirect valuations in that. So for example, very few people actually watch TV over the air, relatively speaking, 10, 15% or so in that. But because being a TV station actually gives you very valuable rights to be on cable, just being on the air is really just a secondary objective to getting those secondary rights, namely to be carried by the local cable channel at no cost. Spectrum has become a foreclosure option, as in the main value of having spectrum is that nobody else can enter my service territory, not necessarily that I want to use it myself, say for mid-band and low-band spectrum. Spectrum coexistence, we talked about radio astronomy, but this has been a big problem, for example, for GPS, simply because the transmit power and receive powers are so different across neighboring bands, and so you're going to have many more of those cases. And again, radio astronomy and GPS being the primary examples, and satellite to some extent as well. We also have a long-term problem. How do we deal with spectrum interference? So pirate radio has been the best known one. And I found, and you see this in the bottom, the first case that I was able to find with a little bit of research, this is in an amateur radio operator was fined in 1914 for being a pirate, essentially, for being unlicensed one. We have really odd ones. LED signs have become big unintentional transmitters in that, so big kind of signs on stores and stuff, and billboards and so on. And we have intentional jamming in that. So I'll give you an example, which is kind of funny in a sense that these took place like 7 years apart. For some reason, they both involve Ford pickup trucks and the New Jersey, New York Newark airport, where somebody basically bought a GPS jammer so that their location could not be tracked. Again, not classical pirate radio, not anything to that, but clearly a safety risk in this particular case. So say enforcement of radio etiquette is problematic. We've had the van model, it doesn't scale. When you can find a few piece of people like the airport interferers because they're so high value, but it's really hard to use that to capture all the LED interferers, for example. And indeed, so this is not a new problem. In the early part of the 20th century, when radio became commercial, since then, we have really required station identification so that each emitter had to regularly identify who they were and where they operated, so that if it misbehaved, you could visit that particular place and tell them to stop doing that or fine them, whatever the case may be. So we probably need a new model that does not rely on vans driving around, but relies on self-identifying ones. It wouldn't deal with the jammers, but it deals with many of the other intentional and unintentional emitters. Let me conclude. It used to be pretty simple in spectrum land, and this is still valuable to some extent. Again, talking about terahertz, do you just move up in frequency? All of that moving up is largely, again, leaving your terahertz bands aside, is largely done. All the bands have been or in the process of being auctioned and assigned, with a few exceptions left. Now we have a much more complex interaction of coordinating, of displacing an impaired spectrum that we need to deal with. For about 20 years, auctions were the undisputed mechanisms outside the unlicensed world to allocate spectrum to the best use case in that, as in kind of the least bad way of doing it. We've now, I think, discovered, because of changes in technology and the business model concerns, that auctions should not be the only mechanism in that. And that is one of the research areas that we will be pursuing. What can we do that go beyond auctions that don't have all the drawbacks that I identified earlier? And from the very beginning, we should think about, as we build particularly spectrum sharing environments, where you have spectrum models and so on, how do you deal with misbehaving users, misbehaving either intentionally or unintentionally, that can actually ensure, particularly incumbents, that their concerns are enforceable in a reasonable time frame. It doesn't do radio astronomy any good if theoretically interference that they experience is illegal, if that interferer cannot be found, or it takes months to resolve that. You might as well not have spectrum rights at all. So enforcement has to be part of the discussion from the very beginning and has to be planned into the assignment of spectrum. And with that, if there's time left, I'll take questions.